Hi, I'm Reed. This is Crowland Publishing, and here's another in our lore series where we take elements of folklore, mythology, religion, social custom, and history, and we steal them for our RPGs. So we're going to do something a little bit different today, and we're going to focus in on one weird folkloric episode. So we'll be talking about the Sicilian witch trials and what happened when the Spanish Inquisition met the donas de fueras, the ladies from the outside, a very peculiar fairy tradition. So before we really get into it, a little bit of historical context. Around 1500, and for about 300 years after, Sicily was conquered by the Spanish, which means the Inquisition and the witch trials we're talking about are part of the Spanish Inquisition. Now, yes, the Spanish Inquisition and all the Inquisitions could be very, very brutal, especially the Spanish Inquisition. But it was mainly anti-Semitic in nature. It's mainly looking for Jews to convert and punish and steal from. But when we have a look at any Inquisition's actual court documents, you would be surprised by how often they find people innocent, how often they go, well, this was clearly not devil worship, it was just people running around in the forest, it was clearly just someone doing medicine, and even when they are found guilty of supernatural crimes, often they're just jailed or paid a fine. So the Inquisition is bad, but it's not the horror show of Roger Corman movies. So let's get into it, but why not give us a subscribe, give us a like, and okay. Now, Sicily has a really lively and really interesting folklore, and a lot of this stuff is polluted by amateur writers and pop culture writers who claim to be experts. So if any of that is leaked into my analysis, any academics out there, feel free to correct me. But there was essentially a thriving witch cult in Sicily for a very, very long time. And an anthropologist by the name of, and I love this name, Sabina Magliocco, identifies the witches as being something called fixers, or magea, magic users, and she identifies a folk religion of wise women and cunning men that are existing, integrated, well-known and well-liked in Sicilian society. And you know the kind of thing, these amulets for luck, healing medicine, protection from evil, prayers. And during the mid-1700s, a priest by the name of Tartarotti talks about that he's discovered a cult to Diana, which has survived for a very, very long time. Now, was he right? I don't know. No one does. But it's very interesting because Diana is the Roman version of Hecate and the Roman version of Artemis kind of rolled into one, a goddess of sorcery and the virgin huntress who protects women. So you've got a thriving tradition of witches living in a society who are liked and respected in the society as well. And then along comes an organization that exists to kill witches. But there's a very, very famous specific strain of witchcraft because these witches didn't work with the devil. They worked with the ladies from the outside. They worked with fairies. So just so we're all on the same page, there is some debate about what the definition of a fairy is, but I think that if you consider fairies as basically a supernatural people who live alongside humanity but hidden with specific supernatural abilities and gifts, you won't go wrong with thinking about fairies like that. And the ladies from the outside is this very specific Sicilian tradition. Now, we have a surprisingly large amount of information about what the ladies are, and most of this comes from a specific trial called the Trial of the Fisherwife of Palermo. And it's raunchy, but anyway, let's talk about the fairies. Let's talk about the ladies. So the ladies of the outside, they're mainly women, not entirely. They're very, very beautiful, and they're dressed in black or white or red gowns. So I'll put up some photos right now of the kinds of dresses they might have worn. I don't really know how to describe them. I don't have the vocabulary, but look at the vast amounts of material. Look at the incredible sewing and embroidering, the gems. Remember, nobles wear clothing to display their wealth and their power. And GM should absolutely play that up. Think about what genre you're in. If you were deciding to use these fairies in, say, Call of Cthulhu, historical might work. If you are in a high fantasy campaign, you might want to really play up the more fantastic elements of these gowns. So the ladies often appear in groups of 5 or 7, one of them playing a lute or a guitar. That's usually a guy dressed up like a soldier for some reason, because they like to dance. The ladies like to dance, and they like to dance on their strange feet, which are horses' hooves or cat's paws. Now, I've read it as well, but this was only on a dodgy Google Translate from an Italian paper, that there were only 33 ladies, and they served someone called the Major Mother. I'm not sure about that though. But what we do know is that every Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday, the ladies would appear in a forest, and they specifically wanted to meet and work with witches who had quote-unquote sweet blood. which means either that they're talking about liking nice people, or they literally drank the blood of witches. Yeah, I think I know which one is more interesting to me. They can transform themselves into cats, and they could also take the form of a monster called an Aeodon when they needed to war. The Aeodon is allowed to kill people. We do not know what an Aeodon actually looked like. So during these meetings, the ladies would often take the witches to Benevento. Now, Benevento is a real place. It's a city in Naples, but it seems to have been used in this context as a kind of fairyland. Either they just liked the name, or it was an imaginary version of the real city. It also might reflect the myths of Blockula, which is a Swedish witch tradition. It's kind of like the devil's private island where he would take women to have sex with them. And there, in Benevento, you would meet the beautiful Queen of Fae and her husband, who was a red-skinned boy. They would have you swear allegiance to them over God and over other earthly monarchs, and then literally the orgies begin. If you read the witch trials, it's very, very rude. Too rude for me to talk about it, so go look it up if you like. Crowland After Dark. But let's just say that, this is not the first time in mythology that women have gotten off with hot monsters. I don't know why that is. Every March in Sicily, several troops of the ladies would gather, and the Red Boy Prince would appear. And this is important. He would, in March, tell the ladies of the outside to be good, to be moral. So their morality is a law that they follow. That being said, they are basically benevolent creatures. They're spoken of warmly. The official wife of Palermo, who is one of the women who gives a first-hand discussion of this pretty raunchy sexual contact between her and a bunch of male elves, they give her magical medicine, which allows her to have a very, very rewarding career as a healer. But you can offend them. There's a fun story about a guy who's playing his guitar, remember, because they like music. So they're listening to him invisibly, but he gets up and he bumps into one, so they give him a curse. They give him cramps. Also, you're not allowed to talk about the God or the Virgin Mary. That insults them. They just don't talk about it. They like to move from house to house on these sort of moving parties where they will eat people's food. Apparently one guy said that he hosted them at dinner. They also really, really like to play with babies. So essentially, you're just there with this kind of traditional riotous fun behavior. The ladies are there to have fun. Then the Inquisition comes. Now, the Inquisition starts in 1579, and it ends in 1651 in Sicily. And it's not really that big a deal. This is not sort of the horror fields that you might be thinking of, that you think about in movies. In 80 years, there's 60 arrests, there's very few punishments. I personally couldn't find really any torture ordered to phase. And I think this is because this is not a discussion about Satan. It's not really, the fairy traditions just don't really exist in Catholicism. And also, this is a tradition of the working classes. Now, here's the thing about the Inquisition is that it changes a lot from place to place, from time to time. It's very different. And running an actual Inquisition is time-consuming and it's laborious. And one of the payoffs for the church, and I don't know if this was existing in Sicily at the time, but sometimes the church could confiscate property from who they found guilty. So if you're going after a noble, maybe you get his palazzo, maybe you get 10 stallions, 30 yards of silk, half a ton of spices. But if you find a peasant guilty of heresy and Satanism, you get 3 turnips and a nasty rash. I highly recommend you read a book called Caliban and the Witch for more on this. But as well is that Sicily is occupied territory with a long history of bloody revolutions. The Inquisition can't just torture everyone that they please. They can't just overthrow everyone. They have political and military opposition. So it's not that simple as they turn up with their weird pointy hats and everyone's on fire. And if everyone is involved in this folk magic, if this cult is that widespread and every village has a few wise women, which it did, the church is powerful, but it's not above the law. It can't completely change society and it can't arrest every single person. People like the ladies. They are good. They are popular. And this is fascinating to me. They do not read to the early modern mindset as demons. This is not black magic. However, it is magic, and the church, the church's attitude towards magic is a very, very complicated issue, but generally speaking, it's not huge on magic that it doesn't control. So there are trials, and probably the best well-known of these trials is a woman called Vincenzia Larosa. Vincenzia had a very, very similar story to the official wife of Palermo. She is a local woman. She meets an elf called Martinillo. Martinillo takes her off to Benevento for all the weird elf sex that you can have. She also is trained, and again, it's in medicine. So she likes to tell this story. She tells everyone the story. I learned my skills from my hot elf boyfriend who shags me in the devil's playground. She gets arrested. She gets on trial. And they exile her, which she ignores. And then they exile her again, which seems to take. At the very least, we don't hear from her again in history. So that's it, is that you're not really getting punished for dealing with the good ladies of the outside. And by 1651, the whole thing's over. And it's very interesting because in 1650, some of the other witch trials in places like Scotland and Sweden are getting really hard to read about, and they're really, really rough. But not Sicily. In Sicily, it's all kind of over. Now, I don't know really where the ladies fit into modern-day Sicilian traditions. I haven't seen a lot of them. They don't seem to be as ingrained into the culture as, say, the Latvian pagan traditions are. But there you go. That is the story of the ladies of the outside of Sicily, and the witch trials that failed to significantly deal with them. Now onto the game stuff. But I should just say that if you are liking this, why don't you give me a thumbs up right now? Now, I think this is obviously pretty gameable. You want to do a good approximation of fantasy Sicily, I would highly recommend that you read a novel called Tigana by my old favourite Guy Gavriel Kay and play The Witcher Blood and Wine video game. And here's some ways that I would try and set up a campaign using the ladies of the outside. Now, being an Inquisitor is always a fantastic basic campaign setup. Not the torturing all women, but essentially that you are a force that polices contact with dangerous supernatural elements. Now, I'm going to do this video as if you're playing a fantasy game, but you might want to think about it as being a Call of Cthulhu game rather than D&D, or a historical horror game rather than high fantasy. But the idea is that basically the Inquisition means that you work for a religious authority who's looking for trouble and prosecuting that trouble. It's your job to stop the heresy and the monstrous contact with the devil. So your Inquisitor guys, they go into the community and they discover that there's a supernatural element to it. Maybe you have been told, if you find anything supernatural, kill it. Good or bad, we don't care. We're the Inquisition, you are Inquisitors, you kill it. So the game could be learning that the ladies are not exactly good guys, but they're certainly not baddies either. They're sure as hell not malevolent. Now, yes, they're sewing local women in witch heaven like a sewing machine, but they're not dragging people down to hell. They're not corrupting them. They are asking for loyalty towards their weird fairy court over in Witch Island. But they're not really corrupting your souls or anything. And the party suddenly has a great conflict because what do you do when your lived experience says, look, these are not bad people, they're not hurting anyone, but your organizational demands are kill it. And I think that you would have a really, really good conflict within the party and a whole bunch of interpersonal conflict and a whole bunch of what's right, what's wrong, which I don't know about you, but I love in an RPG. Another campaign idea, maybe you were just a group of people who live in this society. But remember, we talked about the ladies being commanded to be moral? That's a command that can change. And suddenly you've got these invisible people who can drag you off to fairyland and who know the secrets of magic and medicine, and they want to hurt you. Also, they're like babies. How do you fight an invisible, powerful enemy who knows you incredibly well? What has happened to change their attitude towards humanity? I think that would be a fantastic, tense, really horror movie kind of vibe, because you have a deadline. They will kill you. They have soldiers. They have incredible power. You must find and you must repair the relationship with the ladies of the outside. And of course, maybe the outside is not just fairyland. Maybe these are in fact Lovecraftian entities who have come from very, very far outside indeed. Or maybe you just want to use them for an adventure. Maybe you need their medicine, so you've got to make friends with the ladies. And they like music and they like dancing and they like sex with humans, so you know, there's a potentially mature readers only kind of adventure. Get a few photographs of Orlando Bloom and Photoshop them in ways that I'm too young to know about. And I think that especially if you've got a group of witches and cunning men who are your adventuring party, you could have like a really, really interesting and unique campaign where it's all about making friends with people. And maybe the witches themselves, well, we've already seen that they're divided up into different companies. Maybe there's weird fairy politics that you can become involved with. Or maybe you want to really mix it up. Maybe you want to do something that's a very, very strange kind of campaign. 5 or 7, that's had the number that the ladies appear in. That's a pretty common number for games and for gamers at a table. So maybe you need to protect your sweet-blooded witch people who you have been carefully farming, if you will, as fairies. Maybe you need to use your magic and invisibility to see off witch hunters, but you don't want to be overtly violent because the Inquisition, they can bring pretty significant resources to bear if they need to. And of course, we know that you can turn into monsters. We know that we've got the Aeodons who do hunt and kill humans. So you can have a bit of conflict, you can have a bit of blood and guts if you like. And lastly, not all the witches in Italy are good. There is the Malendanti Cult, evil witches who spread disease and they curse people and they hail Satan and they blight crops and all that kind of stuff. And you have to protect the ladies from the snares of the Malendanti, find the Benendanti, their ancient enemies, and keep to the pact between the ladies of the outside and humans and stop this satanic invasion and stop this satanic corruption of the ancient relationship between the good ladies of the outside. Now, that's it. I think we've got enough campaign ideas out of that. I'm Reed, and this is Crowland. Why don't you give us a like, and I'll see you soon. Bye now.